On the 23rd of January, 1860, Samuel Kirkland, the governor of Iowa, received a requisition. It was from the governor of Virginia, Henry Wise. He was looking for a 21-year-old man named Barclay Coppock. He was wanted, the requisition said, as he was a fugitive from the justice of Virginia. Kirkland said the language used was too vague and sent the courier back to Virginia. When the courier returned 3 months later, Kirkland issued a warrant for Coppock's arrest. But when the sheriff and the courier got to Springdale, Iowa, Barclay Coppock had disappeared. Barclay Coppock was born on the 4th of January, 1839, in Salem, Ohio. His father died when he was a baby, so when his mother remarried, she moved the family to Springdale, Iowa. Springdale, Iowa was a community comprised mostly of Quakers. Most Quakers in the decades before the Civil War were abolitionists, and the Springdale community was no exception. It was a well-traveled stop on the Underground Railroad, and the Quakers in Iowa were so notorious for helping escaped slaves that one slave catcher remarked it was easier to find a needle in a haystack than a fugitive slave amongst Quakers. Barclay had poor lungs and was described later as a little sickly looking. Sorry, dude. So he likely wasn't able to socialize a lot, and he was certainly less outgoing than his older brother Edwin, but the two shared a close bond. In late December of 1857, when Barclay was just 18, a tall man with an intense, serious demeanor and his sons arrived in Springdale and rented a house for the winter. The man's name was John Brown. John Brown was already famous by the time he arrived in Iowa. He had taken stands against pro-slavery militias during the summer of Bleeding Kansas, earning him the nickname Osawatomie Brown. Several of the men John Brown brought with him to Iowa spent the winter drilling and training. The Quakers thought they were training to go back to Kansas and fight for abolition there. Barclay and Edwin, seeing Brown's displays, yearned to join Brown, and against their mother's wishes, they did. Barclay believed he was going into the South, or what John Brown had coined Africa, to free slaves in an armed rebellion. Barclay and his brother followed Brown to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, training at a farmhouse that Brown had rented in Sandy Hook, Maryland. Barclay and the rest of the men had to stay hidden during the daytime so that locals would not become suspicious of their intentions. There were many delays. Brown had hoped to start the raid on July 4th, but he had neither the men nor the equipment to start it at that point. Finally, Brown got the weapons and the men he needed to begin freeing the slaves, and so on the 16th of October, their mission began. John Brown selected 3 men, the ones least fit to fight, to stay behind and guard the farm and the rest of the weapons. Barclay was one, on account of his bad lungs, his inexperience, and his age. The other 2 men who were left behind were Owen Brown and Francis Merriam. Edwin and Barclay said goodbye to each other. Edwin marched off with the rest of Brown's men. Barclay remained, guarding the farmhouse. While the rest of Brown's men saw intense action, Barclay, Francis, and Owen saw pretty much nothing. No one knew what had happened until John Cook escaped the fighting and came back to the farm on the 18th of October. John Cook informed Owen, Francis, and Barclay what had happened and how dire the situation was. They realized that attempting a rescue would be suicidal, and instead gathered supplies at the farmhouse before retreating into the mountains. The party now consisted of Charles Tidd, John Cook, and Owen, Francis, and Barclay. For a while, they had to subsist off what had been left at the farm as they trekked through the mountains. But those supplies dwindled as they made their way through Pennsylvania. John Cook, the most affable of the group, decided he would be the emissary into the nearest town to see if he could gather some food. The first time, he came back with plenty of supplies. But the second time, he never returned. Barclay and his comrades realized that John Cook was likely captured, and, indeed, he had been arrested. John Cook would soon be transported to the same jail and the same cell where Barclay's brother was being held. Francis Merriam, already quite sickly, managed to catch a train bound for Philadelphia and from there on to his home, Boston. Barclay and the others carried on, finally finding refuge with some Quakers in Pennsylvania. From there, the men split ways, and Barclay made his way back to his mother's house in Springdale, Iowa. His arrival was no secret. Everyone in Springdale knew Barclay was back, and, more importantly, they knew where he had been. But finding a fugitive abolitionist amongst Quakers was just as difficult as finding an escaped slave. The community banded together. Virginia had gotten Edwin. but Virginia was not going to get Barclay. The Springdale community was not alone in protecting Barclay. A man more powerful was willing to take extreme risks to protect Barclay too. Governor Samuel Kirkland. As with many covert operations, it's hard to prove whether Kirkland knew of Barclay's whereabouts, but it's likely. Kirkland was an ardent abolitionist and had won his seat as governor based on that persistent issue of slavery. Kirkland even made a speech supporting John Brown. But was that all just talk? Would he go as far as harboring a fugitive? When Samuel Kirkland was given the first requisition on the 23rd of January, he told the representative from Virginia that the language was too vague and he could not issue a warrant for Barclay's arrest. This was, the Virginians felt, not a good enough reason to delay Barclay's arrest for 3 more months while the representative traveled back to Virginia and then back to Iowa. In that time, Virginia's governor changed, Edwin was hanged, and the presidential campaigns began. When Samuel Kirkland received the new, less vague requisition, he issued the arrest warrant, but when the sheriff came, Barclay was gone, or hiding in plain sight. This is where the records differ. Some in Springdale said he had come back to town but had escaped to Canada before the arrest warrant came based on a tip. No one says where the tip came from, but who else would have known about the impending arrest warrant other than the governor? And who else would have known Barclay was in Iowa and therefore would have made up some rather bad excuse about vague wording to give Barclay time to escape other than the governor? Other eyewitnesses, and I think this version, although more unlikely, is funnier, claimed something even bolder. They claimed that the sheriff himself knew where Barclay was, and therefore made a spectacle of the arrest to prove to Virginia's representative that Iowans really were doing all they could to help find Barclay. The sheriff, according to these eyewitnesses, marched through the streets shouting that Barclay Coppock was wanted for treason, that there was a warrant to arrest him, and would someone please speak up if they had seen Barclay Coppock. While the townspeople all lied, shaking their heads and saying they had not seen Barclay since he and his brother joined John Brown, Barclay was calmly sitting in his mother's living room. Barclay certainly did escape to Canada for a brief period, perhaps after the sheriff's loud, obvious attempt to arrest him. But as he was escaping, he left no paper trail as to when he went to Canada. So whichever version of events happened, and I really hope it was the second version of the governor and the sheriff all making a big show of trying to arrest Barclay while he's sitting at his mom's house, Barclay got away. And oh, was Virginia furious. In 1861, after Lincoln's inauguration as President of the United States, Virginia called a state convention to discuss whether or not to secede from the Union. One of the many grievances brought up against the North was that no rendition was made of fugitives from justice. Virginians always felt that Samuel Kirkland had deliberately put up barriers that allowed Barclay to escape, and that the community in Springdale had been aided by Kirkland in their attempts to hide Barclay. So, while Barclay Coppock and Samuel Kirkland are never named in the convention itself, it's clear that Virginia was referring to Barclay's escape when they said, "A requisition is made upon the governor for the man who has violated your own homestead and who has dared to tread with impious footsteps upon Virginia soil. You make a demand upon the governor for him, but the authority cannot be found in the bond which authorizes his restoration. Like the Jew Shylock, he cannot find it stipulated in the bond, and the murderer and the incendiary goes free." Also, yeah, they threw in a bit of anti-Semitism because they really wanted to commit to the bad guy aesthetic. And Virginia was not the only state to mention this grievance. Texas, in their reasons for seceding from the Union, wrote that Northerners have invaded Southern soil and murdered unoffending citizens, and through the press their leading men and a fanatical pulpit have bestowed praise upon the actors and assassins in these crimes, while the governors of several of their states have refused to deliver parties implicated and indicted for participation in such offenses upon the legal demands of the states agreed. So yeah, Iowa also annoyed Texas, however briefly, into leaving the Union. You're welcome. Sometime in 1860, Barclay Coppock returned to America. He traveled to Kansas, where he aided runaway slaves from Missouri to freedom. Then, when the Civil War began, he joined the Union Army. Apparently, his bad lungs were no longer a reason to keep him away from the fighting, and he fought, once again, to free the slaves. He died in Nebraska, near the Platte River on the 4th of September, 1861, when Confederates derailed his train. He, like many others who fought for John Brown, knew that their calling was to end slavery in America, and they would fight until every man was free.